We are going to dot every I and cross every T until we find out what happened to Nolan Wells.
Federal agents made an arrest this week connected to the Nolan Wells case. For a case that has gone months without an answer, those 4 words landed like a thunderclap. An arrest. Finally. Except the man now sitting in a California jail cell has nothing to do with what happened to Nolan Wells on the water off Horn Island. He has everything to do with what happened after, with what people said, with what people threatened, and with a package that was never actually sent but was described in enough detail to bring the full weight of the FBI down on a man 3,000 miles away. This is the story of how a bomb threat, a family court judge, and a stepson's loyalty collided into a federal case, one that has nothing to do with solving Nolan's death and everything to do with what this case has turned into. A place where a courtroom in Mississippi and a computer screen in Sacramento are now part of the same investigation, where a judge who has never spoken publicly about the case had to, and where the answer everyone wants, what actually happened to Nolan, is no closer today than it was last week. We're going to walk through exactly what these messages said, how investigators found the man behind them, who he turns out to be, and why his target was never a stranger to this case at all. And we're going to end where this always ends, because no matter how many new names and new charges get added to this story, the same question keeps coming back around unanswered. What actually happened to Nolan Wells? Before we go further, a quick note on where things stand. There is a lot of noise around this case. Threats, accusations, doctored audio, competing narratives. We're going to try to cut through as much of it as we can, sticking only to what's been confirmed through court filings and official statements. If you're new here, we'd encourage you to watch with that in mind. The messages started arriving on July 11th. Judge Ashlee Cole, who sits on the Chancery Court bench in Jackson County, Mississippi, opened her Facebook account to find a direct message waiting for her. It came from an account using the name YAA962. It read like nothing she'd received before. "There will be a package coming to your guy's office in the next few days," the message said. "It's gonna blow you away when you see it, LOL. Probably best to have the boys there to see as well." Court documents show the messages didn't stop there. Another arrived describing blood. So much blood everywhere. Hard to clean, especially from a boat. "But yours will be quick, I promised. I got all your info. Not even the FBI can stop this. Once that package is opened, the timer will start. And then you have maybe 10 seconds or less to ask God for forgiveness." This is the same group that flew search planes over the island in the first days after Nolan went missing, working off currents and water temperature to guess where a body might surface. They've stayed involved in the months since, watching the online conversations spiral in directions they say has actively worked against the investigation. Their leadership has said publicly that misinformation and unverified claims have made it harder, not easier, for the public to separate fact from speculation, and that they only pass information to law enforcement once they believe it's been verified, rather than releasing it themselves. Turning over hundreds of collected tips is, by their own description, an attempt to hand professionals what they've gathered rather than letting it keep circulating as raw, unfiltered rumour. Whether anything inside that report moves the investigation forward is something only Jackson County authorities can determine. What it represents, regardless of outcome, is another example of private citizens stepping into a space where official answers have been slow to arrive. The same vacuum that, in a very different and far darker way, a man in Sacramento also stepped into when he decided threatening a judge was somehow his role to play in this story. And then there's the audio. An independent audio engineer spent hours enhancing a 37-second clip of the emergency call made from the boat the day Nolan disappeared. The call to the towing company after the vessel began taking on water. Once cleaned up, some listeners online said they could make out words in the background, fragments, questions, things that, if real, would suggest something far more troubling happened on that water than anyone has said publicly. A forensic audio expert who reviewed both versions on national television came to a different conclusion. He found the enhanced version ran 20 seconds longer than the original recording, with an entirely different digital fingerprint. His team ran their own transcription process on both, working from the audio alone, without any preconceived idea of what they were supposed to hear. Nothing resembling the disputed phrases showed up in either version. He was careful to note something else too. Once people are told what to listen for, the mind starts finding it, whether or not it's actually there. An attorney representing one of the other friends in Nolan's group went even further, calling the enhanced clip doctored outright, paired with what he described as a fabricated transcript designed to make listeners hear things that were never said. The engineer who created the enhancement hasn't backed down. She stands by her work and says she's encouraged federal investigators to run it through equipment more advanced than anything available to her. As of now, there's been no public indication that they have. It's worth pausing on why this particular dispute matters so much, beyond the specifics of one audio clip. This case has almost no physical evidence that's been made public. No definitive cause of death, no named suspect, no confirmed timeline of exactly what happened once the friend group's boat started taking on water. In that vacuum, a 37-second recording becomes something much bigger than a phone call to a towing company. It becomes the thing people point to when they want certainty in a case that has offered almost none. Whether that certainty is real or imagined depends entirely on which expert you believe, and right now, the experts don't agree. So that's where this case sits. A federal defendant with a criminal past and a 5-year maximum sentence hanging over a threat he allegedly made against a judge who wanted nothing to do with any of this. A reward climbing towards 6 figures. A tip report headed to the district attorney's desk. An audio clip that half the internet believes reveals the truth and that at least one forensic expert says reveals nothing at all. And at the center of all of it still is an 18-year-old who went out on the water on the 4th of July and never made it home the way everyone else did. No one has been arrested for that. No one has been named a suspect for that. Investigators say they found no evidence of a crime. But no evidence of a crime isn't the same thing as an answer. And it isn't the same thing as knowing why a healthy teenager ended up in shallow water near the last place he was ever seen alive. The messages, the threats, the arrest, all of it exists because people wanted answers badly enough to start pointing fingers at teenagers who may have had nothing to do with any of it. That anger found a target in a judge whose only tie to any of it was raising one of them. It did not find an answer for Nolan. That's still out there. Whatever happened on that boat, on that island in those hours before his body was found, that story hasn't been told yet. Not by investigators, not by an audio engineer, not by anyone. Nolan Wells still doesn't have his answer, and until he does, nothing else in this case is actually resolved, no matter how many headlines say otherwise. Every part of this story we've just walked through, the threat, the arrest, the reward, the report, the audio, exists downstream of one unanswered question. Strip all of it away, and what's left is exactly what was left the day his body was found on that shoreline. A family without a cause of death. A group of friends who say they've cooperated from the beginning and are still living under suspicion. And a case file that, months later, still doesn't say what happened to Nolan Wells in those final hours. Only that whatever it was, it hasn't been ruled a crime, and it hasn't been ruled anything else either. That's the story that isn't finished. Everything else, the arrests, the reward money, the disputed recordings, the lawyers issuing statements on cable news, is noise around the edges of it. Real noise with real consequences for real people. But noise all the same until someone can finally say, with evidence behind it, what actually happened to Nolan Wells. If you want to stay with this story as it develops, consider subscribing to this channel. We'll keep following it until there's an answer worth calling one. Read those words once and they're disturbing. Read them again knowing who Judge Cole is to this case and they become something else entirely. Think about what's actually being described here, not a vague warning, not an angry rant typed in the heat of the moment and forgotten 5 minutes later. A specific claim of a package already being prepared. A specific location, her office, a specific method, an explosive device with a timer, and a chilling kind of confidence running underneath all of it. This idea that not even federal law enforcement could stop what was coming. Whoever sent these messages wanted Judge Cole to believe there was nothing she could do but wait for the package to arrive, and that not even the country's largest federal law enforcement agency could get to them first. That's the kind of message that doesn't get read once and dismissed. It gets forwarded straight to federal authorities because there's no way to know in the moment, whether it's an empty threat or the first documented step towards something far worse. Because Ashlee Cole isn't a random target. She's the stepmother of Warren Hudson, one of the friends who was with Nolan Wells on the boats near Horn Island over the 4th of July weekend, one of the friends who has spent weeks defending himself and the rest of the group against accusations they've called baseless. And now, according to the messages, his stepmother's office was the target of a threatened explosive device. The person behind the account didn't stop at direct messages. Records show a call was placed to the Chancery Court's office in the early morning hours of July 11th, around 1:27 a.m. Whoever was behind the account wanted to be heard more than once. For days, the identity behind Yai 962 was just a username, a shadow account making promises no one could verify or dismiss. That changed when federal investigators started pulling threads most people never think about. The email tied to a Facebook account, the IP addresses behind that email, the digital breadcrumbs that lead, eventually, to a real address. That trail led agents to Sacramento, California, and to a 27-year-old man named Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumarce. Investigators cross-referenced the email associated with the account against phone records and address history. What came back was consistent enough to move forward. Dumarce was taken into custody and charged with interstate transmission of a threatening communication, a federal charge that carries a maximum of 5 years in prison, a $250,000 fine, and 3 years of supervised release afterward. But the arrest itself only answers part of the question. The other part is who Dumarce actually is. And that answer complicates the picture rather than simplifying it. Public sex offender registry records show Dumarce has a criminal history that predates any involvement in the Wells case entirely. In 2019, he was convicted of annoying or molesting a child under the age of 18. In 2020, a second conviction followed for sending harmful material with intent to seduce a minor. He was released from custody in California in 2023. At the time of his arrest, he was listed as a transient in Sacramento. None of that history connects him to Nolan Wells, to Horn Island, or to anyone in Nolan's friend group. What it does show is a man with a documented pattern of predatory behaviour online, now allegedly directing that same impulse toward threats of violence against a sitting judge and her family. A judge whose only connection to any of this is being related to someone the internet decided to put on trial. There's no indication anywhere in the public record that Dumarce had ever visited Mississippi, knew anyone connected to Nolan's case personally, or had any real stake in the outcome of the investigation at all. By every account so far, he was simply watching this unfold online, the same way millions of other people have been watching it unfold, scrolling through commentary and theories and viral clips from 3,000 miles away. Somewhere in that scrolling, according to the criminal complaint, he decided to act, not by weighing in with an opinion, but by allegedly typing out a countdown to violence and sending it to a woman who has never once spoken publicly about the case herself. That's the part of this story that's easy to skip past and shouldn't be. This case has produced accusations, doxing, and now, according to federal prosecutors, an alleged bomb threat, all aimed at people who are, at most, one connection removed from Nolan Wells himself. Judge Cole isn't a witness. She isn't a person of interest. She's a stepmother who happened to share a household with a teenager who was present that day. And that was enough, allegedly, to put her name and her office in the crosshairs of a threat serious enough to trigger a federal indictment. Judge Cole hadn't planned to speak publicly about any of it. Her family has largely stayed out of the spotlight since Nolan's death, even as her stepson became one of the most scrutinized young men in the country. That changed when the threats forced her hand. She posted a screenshot of the messages to her own account days before charges were even filed, saying she wouldn't be speaking further to the media because, in her words, that wasn't the appropriate forum to elaborate on the facts of July 4th. She added something else too, that she understood the truth wouldn't stop calls for the death of her own small children. Read that again. Calls for the death of her children, because of a case she has no role in beyond family, because her stepson was on a boat with a teenager who never made it home. Judge Cole isn't the only person connected to this case who has said something similar. Nolan's own mother has described her family being targeted with online harassment in the weeks after her son's death. And more recently, another family connected to the friend group announced plans to pursue legal action against online content creators they say have spread false accusations and orchestrated harassment campaigns against them. Two families on opposite sides of whatever actually happened on Horn Island, both describing the same thing, being threatened, harassed and targeted over a case where the central question still doesn't have an answer and may not have one for a long time to come. That's the temperature this case has reached. A family court judge with no public profile in this story, forced to break her silence not to comment on evidence or theories, but simply to say her children are being threatened with death over something they had no part in. And it's worth sitting with that for a moment before we move forward, because it reframes everything about this arrest. This isn't a break in the investigation into how Nolan died. It's a consequence of the investigation itself, of how large, how loud, and how unmoored from evidence the public conversation around this case has become. Somewhere in that noise, a man in California decided a judge's family deserved to be threatened with an explosive device. That's what got solved this week. Not Nolan. Investigators have been clear, and they've been clear for weeks. There is no evidence of a crime in Nolan Wells' death. No suspect has been named. Nothing about this arrest changes that. The two cases run on separate tracks. One is a federal threat investigation with a named defendant and formal charges. The other is a death investigation that remains months later without an answer, that hasn't stopped the pressure from building on every other front. Days before this arrest became public, Dr. Benjamin Hudson, Warren's father, announced he was putting up $50,000 of his own money. Not to point fingers. He was careful to say his family isn't accusing anyone specific of anything. The reward is for information leading to an arrest and conviction of whoever is responsible for Nolan's death, if anyone is. He said he hopes it will get people talking who've stayed quiet because of exactly the kind of pressure that led a man in Sacramento to type out a bomb threat over Facebook Messenger. Around the same time, the volunteer search and rescue group that helped comb Horn Island in the days after Nolan disappeared announced it was handing over everything it has gathered. Hundreds of tips collected since the search began, sifted and compiled into a formal report, headed to the sheriff's office, the district attorney and Nolan's family. The organization was careful to say the findings don't implicate anyone. It's an investigative tool, not a conclusion.